My great-aunt Mary had heard about the dangers of interacting with the world of the dead since her youth, but a series of unfortunate events in her life, and of course, her curiosity about the life after death, led her down a path that would open a door that should have remained closed forever. It all happened in 1986 when Aunt Mary was a young woman during a seance ritual. What happens after death? This was a question that had occupied Aunt Mary's mind since childhood, especially when she lost her father at the age of 8. Despite being raised in a religious family that believed in the afterlife, the common beliefs and what was stated in the holy books did not convince her logical and curious mind. What she had read or heard about seances was so full of ambiguity and doubt that she couldn't easily believe in them. However, ultimately, another bitter death that occurred in her life compelled her to practically experience a seance for the first and last time. Aunt Mary was only 20 when she received the news of her young husband's death, James, just after giving birth to their daughter. James's death was so sudden and unbelievable that Mary had only one wish: to reconnect to the man she had loved so passionately for one last time. That's why, 6 months after James's death, she decided to summon his spirit. The seance ritual took place in the small house of one of Aunt Mary's close friends and old classmates named Thelma, with the presence of 3 people: Aunt Mary, Thelma, and a middle-aged woman nicknamed Sophie, who was a trusted and reliable medium. The warning Sophie uttered before the seance began was strange, that others besides James might be present during the seance. Aunt Mary was somewhat afraid of this statement, but the excitement of reconnecting with James one last time and finding answers to her questions about the afterlife did not deter her, even though she still didn't entirely believe in summoning spirits. They drew all the curtains in the room to make it dark. The only light present was from a candle on a short stand placed in the middle of the room, around which they were seated. On the table was a large white paper with the alphabet on one side and the numbers 0 to 9 written in a curved manner with a marker, and an inverted undercup with an arrow drawn on it amidst the numbers and letters. Sophie asked Mary and Thelma to place their index fingers lightly on the glass without touching it, and after the necessary preparations were made, the seance began with Sophie's sentence: "Is anyone in the room?" The seance lasted for 4 hours. Sophie's was right. Aunt Mary spoke of the presence of others besides James, and what surprised her was the movement of the undercup on the paper and the display of letters after asking questions, all without any slightest hand movement. After several unsuccessful attempts, Aunt Mary finally managed to establish contact with James, and to ensure that there was no doubt about Sophie's integrity, she asked James questions that she was certain Sophie and even Thelma didn't know the answers to. Questions such as James's grandfather's name or his father's middle name. Aunt Mary was deeply excited because all the answers were correct, and she was sure that the one she was talking to was James. James mentioned his presence in another dimension. He knew he was dead, even knew how he died, but had no idea how much time had passed since his death, because time in the dimension he was in was different. This was exactly what Aunt Mary had heard from several others that were summoned before James. Surely the experience Aunt Mary had that night was amazing, but the terrifying events of her life began from that night onwards, after her last request to James. Aunt Mary asked James if she can just hold him and hug him one last time before he leaves, and James only had one answer: yes. The silence had engulfed the room, and Aunt Mary's heart was pounding fast. The only thing Aunt Mary remembers from that moment was a feeling of intense and strange coldness all over her body, as if they had thrown a wet cloth over her body, while the house was warm as before and no windows were open. It was shortly after this that Aunt Mary felt a sudden pressure drop, and when she came back to herself, everything had come to an end, or so she thought, because she gradually realized that James wasn't the only one who was summoned that night. That night when Aunt Mary returned home, she cried out of joy for hours. Although she had lost James like she had lost her father forever, the feeling that they were alive somewhere else diminished their sorrow and gave her life a new meaning. But as more days passed, Aunt Mary discovered that other events were unfolding, events that brought terror into her life, and she experienced them for the first time a week after the summoning ceremony. Aunt Mary had Clara, her 3-year-old daughter, sleeping beside her that night, when she woke up with a strange feeling, similar to the chill she experienced during the seance. For a moment she was happy, thinking that James had come to her again, but as soon as she opened her eyes, she froze in fear. What she saw before her was a girl in a white dress with pierced blue eyes, standing beside the bed. Aunt Mary's breath was caught in her chest. She closed her eyes and opened them again, and this time there was no trace of the girl. Everything seemed like a dream, maybe just an illusion, but the feeling of coldness persisted, tormenting her. She preferred to turn around and hug Clara to forget what she saw, but as soon as she turned back, all she saw were the blue and staring eyes of the girl in white. Aunt Mary screamed and quickly turned on the lights, but apart from Clara, who had woken up from fear and was crying, there was no one in the room. The events of that night marked the beginning of the hallucinations Aunt Mary would experience day and night. Though she never saw the girl with blue eyes again, she was not the only one Aunt Mary saw, and that was something she couldn't hide from her family and friends. Aunt Mary had not told her family, not even my mother, about the seance, but after a while, the others also noticed her fears and strange behaviors. My mother vividly remembered 2 incidents where random objects fell to the ground in Aunt Mary's house, and shortly after that, Aunt Mary had to tell the truth. It had been over 30 years since the night Aunt Mary summoned the spirit, but she still occasionally felt the chill, a coldness that she knew would show her what would happen next. She had no answer for what she saw during these years, except that on the night of the seance, unintentionally, she had opened a door to the world of spirits. Although Aunt Mary accepted this encounters as part of her life and knew they didn't intend to harm her, this fact did not lessen her fear of what would appear before her eyes this time.